started working together a couple of years ago at first at University of Pennsylvania, and I've been following his work on South Sudan and Ethiopia and political anthropology for a number of years now.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really happy to be a part of this. Happy to have had the chance to read through the book and be a part of this conversation. As Alden said, we've known each other. As Alden said, we've known each other for a long time. So yeah, this is just really exciting to be a part of this project. So I guess I'll just start with one of the first questions that I have for him. So I was really struck by how your book gives a really concrete genealogy of vision and imagination through economic planning, and thinking about how competing ideas of the composition of Sudan were played out in really, really real terms. And in the end, you offer this critique of how we in the contemporary moment often think about economic development and leadership in Africa as exceptionally impoverished and exceptionally corrupt. And when you ask, how Sudan, like quote unquote Sudan and quote unquote failed state have become almost synonymous. So I was wondering if that polemic was a motivating factor for the project.
As I started researching, I've been thinking about, again, you think about how did you come to a certain project, and I was thinking that one of my most formative classes was actually this class who was actually a really sharp political scientist named McCartan Humphrey, but he's a very technical political scientist. And he does a lot of like experiments and complicated math for Africa. But he was an excellent teacher. I think it was Columbia University when I was an undergrad. And we had all these economists and people like that come in. So we had like Leonard Wachakon come in and tell us about African development in relation to caves and how many caves there were and relationship to slavery and trust and geography. And we had Jeffrey Sachs come in and talk about Africa's lack of navigable rivers or climatic reasons and things like that. And I was just kind of left both challenged but unconvinced at these types of variables. Like what could explain, African poverty or African underdevelopment? Could you use those types of methods to explain it? And then when I was at the London School of Economics, I read this book that kind of infuriated me by Douglas Johnson, The Root Causes of Sudan's Civil Wars. And I couldn't quite, it's an excellent book, but I couldn't quite figure out what made me so upset. And I think part of it was that he tries to trace the root cause of a 200-year expanse. And he kind of skips over the independence era altogether. And I wanted to basically make this argument that that we had to think about changing intellectual environments. That these were planners who perhaps had good intentions, but their intentions are shaped by the ideas of the moment, their ways of thinking that they're involved in.
Right. Yeah. That leads to another question I had. I think particularly about the creation of this intellectual environment that they were in, and I really appreciated how your story really compels us to place policymakers within their original intellectual environments, and it reminded me of Nathan Connolly's book on Jim Crow era real estate in Florida. Which also forces us to sort of rethink the production of common sense and recognize why certain planning schemes that may seem corrupt now seem like good ideas in the past. So I guess I was wondering what kinds of things you may have grappled with while you were reconstructing that environment.
That's a really good question. The book that in some ways served as a foil for me was Markets and States by Robert Bates, and he has this idea he says that the problem, he asks why, could reasonable men have done things that are so harmful for their society. He tries to dissect public interest from private interest. And he tries to make it seem as though these are two different, these are two clearly distinguishable things, that you can distinguish public interest from private interest, and you could know that you were making a trade-off. And in my mind, I was like, that's not true. People have really destructive impacts. But but at the time, it seems like that they themselves at the time, and most people around them, believe that they're acting in the public interest.
Right.
And that the public interest itself is something that you intellectually construct. And so in Sudan, it's a bit hard, right? Because on the one hand, you have this question of the center exploiting the periphery, and you have questions of ethnic and racial and religious divides, right? But and those are true, right? And I mean, you know, those of us who are students of Sudan know through the series of civil wars that, of course, these divides shape the way in which people, way in which the elite in Khartoum think about their society and their country. But as I went back, what I started to realize is that that's true, but also the economic wisdom that would have been available to them at the time reinforced those ideas, or didn't challenge any of those prejudices at the same time. And some of that's the colonial legacies of both Britain and Egypt, but it's also the development planning and intellectual environment of the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, I was actually wondering, I guess more in particular to students of Sudan, like how, you know, I guess how you're locating yourself, or how you think how you feel positioned within existing work on Sudan. I guess particularly because you give such a detailed account of the like colonial and post-independence administration in Sudan. It reminds me of Heather Sharkey's book in 2003, and then thinking about the legacies of colonialism, particularly in like these inherited habits of mind, just also reminds me of Mamdani's book in 2009, and a lot of Joke's work as well. So I was wondering how you see yourself in relationship to some of the existing work that's sort of grappling with similar questions.
I mean, in some ways, I'm following someone like Heather Sharkey's work closely, you know, in a portrait of kind of the official mind of the Sudanese elite. But I think one of the things that I'm trying to do is to pull it further into the post-colonial environment. So it's right now, it's not about the creation of a subordinate elite during colonialism, but the emergence of an early post-colonial elite and how that elite tries to reimagine a new state. And of course, and what I didn't realize initially was how much that new state was imagined in the process or in dialogue with international organizations. So many of the actors in the Sudanese Ministry of Finance, in the first 10 years, a lot of their training actually takes place as kind of economic diplomats. As they travel to different international organizations, they become trained in what economics is supposed to mean in the post-colonial, economic management or economic governance is supposed to mean in the post-colonial moment. And so that was a surprise to me. And then I think, in some ways, in relationship to both Mamdani and Jacques Madot-Jacques, part of what I'm trying to open up is that there was something new, right? And so it's not simply a matter of colonial legacies. There's a creation of a new world or a new international order in the post-1945 moment that if anything, Sudanese policymakers find themselves challenged with finding a place within it. And they actually are in some ways hampered by the fact that Britain will no longer play the role that it had played prior to World War II. And the Americans and Russians in some ways don't find Sudan to be that important. And so one of the challenges, I think, of the post-1945 order for a number of African states will be, how do you fit in? And how can you actually find patrons in a new world system that seems to not have a place for you? And so I want to restore some of that indeterminacy to what I think is a larger criticism of the Sudan literature, which sees maybe more continuity, where I think that there should be some discontinuity in the 1950s.
Did you I know you had a lot of I guess just like thinking about methods and things that maybe were surprising to you. I know you had some like really like intimate access to some of the notes of these economic planners. I guess I was wondering like what was most surprising to you going through those archives, and did you find yourself having to read against the grain to illuminate the narrative that you were after?
Mm. I guess when I started naively, I had found some books in the Princeton Library from the 1980s or so, from the, written from the Institute for Development Studies at University of Khartoum, or, some of them were former planning ministers. And so I think naively, I thought that that first generation would have written all these memoirs. And so I went, because British colonial officials often wrote memoirs, and in Sudan, the Islamists who came to power in '89, they're obsessed with writing memoirs as well. But that early generation, I was surprised to find out, didn't actually write that many memoirs, or there weren't that many private papers. And so I initially went thinking I was going to write a more standard looking intellectual history. But what I did find were all these notes about projects and plans. And but they were kind of impersonal, right? I mean, they're kind of like, this project, the budget can change here. Oh, we're running into these sort of smaller problems. And I think that pushed me into trying to take a science studies approach, try to figure out how to read these plans and project notes, especially since they weren't the archive and the archive at the National Records Office in Khartoum isn't cataloged. And so you can get kind of entry numbers, so you don't know what's going to be in the folders that you're getting. So I was there for many months, but I had kind of a scatter shot, both very detailed without much upper level, without many upper level memos. And so that was the biggest challenge, was how to piece together what kind of ideas could have been running through what were sometimes disjointed memos. And so that was what took kind of a reading against the grain, or a science studies approach. How do you put these together? What can I learn from a very specific discussion of managing one particular agricultural scheme and extract that out into a discussion of the economic perspective for the whole country? So in one of my chapters, I talk about railroad management, or this dispute about whether or not private railroad or steamboat operators should be allowed to compete with the Sudan Railroad. And it's about tariffs and pricing and fees. And from those kind of micro details, you're able to extract out larger things like, how is the idea of the economy itself changing in Sudan?
Yeah, so that was something I also wanted to pick up on, this idea of this, what you call in your book, the economizing logic of the planners. And I think that idea like really runs really well throughout the whole text. And you argued that this logic, entrenched a future oriented vision of cost and benefit as the paramount logic of the state. And I think this not only pushes back against previous scholarship, but also brings us to the question of what exactly planners envisioned as this unit of economic development, as a nation or a conglomerate of autonomous regions. And I found this really helpful for overturning assumptions of post-colonial Africa, which forces us to recognize that, what we see now as unified nations were not necessarily the like inevitable outcome of African independence. So I guess I was also wondering, like in the case of Sudan in particular, do you think it's a particularly unique case, given its location on this like imaginary line between, Arab white North Africa and Black sub-Saharan Africa? Like, is there something particular about Sudan that's happening?
I think Sudan is a particularly dramatic case of something that's happening across the continent. But Sudan maybe accentuates dilemmas that are quite common in African countries across the continent, which is, how would you take, on one hand, the kind of a colonial economy, and the colonial economy could feature on a number of maybe disparate sites, right? So it didn't have to claim to manage the nation as a whole. And at the same time, Sudan, like its neighbors, Ethiopia, or Chad, or Mali, or Niger, they find themselves now with national development, they find themselves trying to define what this nation is. And so Sudan, it's easy to think of Sudan because of the civil war and its partition as a particularly divided country, right? But I mean, we often don't think about the fact that Haile Selassie and Ethiopia, which we think of as an ancient entity. I mean, I think Christopher Clapham, you know, often describes it as one of Africa's only non-conquered countries, right? And so it's a bit, we have this idea of it being very old, but we forget that under Haile Selassie's regime, he's conquering large parts of what was once Somalia, or, you know, the idea of a greater Somalia, and the question with Eritrea and the relationship with these different parts. And so these are dilemmas that are very common to the region. But I think they're also tied up with, and this is where I think it goes back to the idea that there were certain ideas that became popular in the post World War II era, one of which is national development, that there should be nations that should be kind of unitary entities, and you should be able to plan for them in the name of the nation. And so I think that was a new intellectual idea of this moment, and it was particularly ill-suited to countries like Sudan, which had yet to settle on the idea of a single Sudanese nation. How could you ask people, how could you ask Southern Sudanese to make sacrifices for national development in the greater Khartoum area? And without at least settling what it meant to be in the nation. So these kind of transfer states modeled on the US. This was a problem, I think, that the export of that model to other parts of the world was a dramatic problem.
Right. Yeah, that actually leads into the next question I had, thinking about the South. So I was, I guess, I'm thinking about financial planning that really centered on the regulation of transportation throughout Sudan, both on the Nile and through the railways, both of which you like really like go into detail in the book, and you know, and particularly like how those regulatory regimes shifted policy thinking to prioritize the entire country as one unit, and like you're saying, it really compels you to think about what, you know, about the outcome, or I guess about the futures of these like peripheral regions to Khartoum, namely the South, right? And you discuss in different parts of the text the autonomy of the South and the discontent of Southern policy thinkers regarding the misalignment of their like political representation and their role as a source of capital accumulation. So I was wondering if you could speak maybe to how like Northern policymakers were thinking of their Southern counterparts, and I guess related to that were the same ideas of proper stewardship of the resources that guided British and Egyptian thinking, also guiding the Northern thinking of the South.
I think that was actually one of the most surprising things, or one of the biggest things that I've had to wrestle with as I transformed my manuscript into a book from the dissertation, was I got a lot more Arabic lectures. I got some of the economic lectures given, you know, both by Egyptian scholars beginning in 1936 or so, the first Egyptian economic expert. And I got some of the early lectures given in the 1950s at the Institute for Higher Studies of the Arab League on the economics of Sudan. And then I got some of the first lectures given by the senior Sudanese lecturer at the University of Khartoum. And so as I was doing that, I could begin to trace the lineage of some of these ideas about the South, right? And one of the things that I discovered, you see it in both the British from the 1930s. So there's the first professor actually at Oxford of colonial economics and later development studies is Herbert Frankel.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see in his ideas very clearly the British idea that investment in most parts of Africa would be non-productive. And so he
Mm-hmm.
says that capital investments outside of things like the Gazera scheme, he actually names the Gazera scheme and the Rand mines of Southern Africa. He thinks that railroads and capital investment outside of that will be unproductive.
Mm-hmm.
He takes a very harsh line. And you see that later in British diplomats talking in the late 1950s to the Sudanese, when the Sudanese are asking for development assistance. They sort of repeat these tropes, right? That, you know, South Sudan is a waste of capital investment. Also, you know, you shouldn't invest in extension of transportation to the West. So these are core ideas sort of circulating, not particular to the Sudanese elite. And then with the Egyptians, you start seeing something slightly different, where it's not necessarily an absolute that capital investment in the southern regions of Sudan would be unproductive, but they start saying that there's cultural problems. That one of the issues with the southern Sudanese or most rural Sudanese is that they don't have organized agriculture. And there's a deep bias in the Egyptian understanding of what would be productive towards irrigated agriculture. So you see there's a bias towards these sort of centralized irrigated schemes, kind of capital intensive schemes that would be organized near Khartoum itself. And so the Sudanese repeat some of these biases and change them a bit. They add in the idea of politics. And so they start saying that, you know, there can be political reforms. You know, we have to unite this as a political entity, but we have to have a unity, right? And so you start seeing also perversely Sudanese nationalists, they want to correct what they saw as some of the mistakes of the British in particular, which was the idea of culturally different zones of the country. And because they said that there were culturally different zones of the country, the British had said those areas had less developmental capability. Those people in those areas had less developmental potential, and therefore they needed to be protected. So Sudanese nationalism becomes defined in opposition to some of those ideas, and it begins to demand a unitary Sudan. But it's kind of a dialogue between Sudanese nationalism, which goes into Sudanese economic planning, and the prejudices prior to that sort of produce their very harsh stance against Southern autonomy. And I think that goes back to why, in some ways, I don't think it's correct to draw. I mean, of course, there are prejudices that come from the 19th century, but I don't think you can understand the ways in which they play out in the mid-1950s simply by drawing a continuous line.
Right. Was the that initial rebellion in the mid-50s in Tori in the South, was that like a big? Did that represent like a big rupture in the way people were like developing these schemes?
So one of the odd things is that the British, starting in the late 1940s but early 1950s, began suddenly, particularly within the Sudan political service, they began suddenly, those British officials who actually worked for what was then the autonomous entity, the government of Sudan, which wasn't part of the colonial service. They suddenly, in the early 1950s, as they realized that they're going to have elections, they suddenly push for the possibility of development schemes in both southern and western Sudan, schemes that they had often ignored prior to that. And so there's this plan in 1951 that suddenly talks about possibilities for development in southern Sudan and western Sudan. And Torit, I think, comes out of a fact that Sudanese nationalists in the early 1950s, in 53 and 54, so Torit rebellion is in 55, they matter-of-factly reject the idea that there will be autonomous regions of Sudan. They don't completely reject this idea, but they are very adamant. I mean, they don't support this. And in part, it was because one of their grievances was that Northern Sudanese had been prevented from accessing the full range of what they saw as Sudan. And they believe that you have to have both Arabic and English. And so they're adamant also that Arabic is the primary language of government, or will become the primary language of government. It takes a while, but. And so they propose an Arabic and English exam, which keeps many of the Southern Sudanese officials out of the government service.
Right.
And so I think it's a weird way in which these debates are tied into forming nationalisms in both South Sudan and Northern Sudan, which are both nationalist projects, but not yet one national project. They don't have what Benedict Anderson calls the, what does he call it? The secular pilgrimage. They don't have one secular educational pilgrimage that they're all passing through. So they have different nationalisms that are contradictory with each other.
Right. I guess also maybe on your methods to sort of like how you were able to like illuminate these like ideologies, but like these economic ideologies and planning. I was wondering if you could just speak more to like what it actually means when, or like what I sort of like what it meant like in practice to apply what you say is this like science of technology studies analytic to the economic tools to, you know, in order to reveal ideologies. I guess I was just wondering what that actually looked like in practice for you.
Oh, sorry.
I was like, was something wrong with my sound?
No, I was on mute.
Yeah, okay.
So methodologically, one of the things I tried to push was the idea that the ideology isn't simply grounded in you know, the more obvious places. So, of course, many of the Sudanese elite coming out of Khartoum, they went to a very few number of colleges, and one of their first places where they formed nationalist circles was in these graduate study groups. So those who had gone to secondary school or those who were going to college would meet, and they would have these graduate study groups. And often their education formally was in English, but they would often do like Arabic literature groups. And so a kind of, one of the ways they distinguished themselves from the British, from their British superiors or other Europeans was that, you know, they had this mastery of the Arabic language that they emphasized. And you see that in Heather Sharkey's work. But so that's one place in which you get kind of ideologies about who we are, right? And so you see the early guys like Meki Abbas talking about themselves as creating a new Mesopotamia. And of course, this is framed against both the Egyptians, so they're not trying to create a new Nile Valley, but also against the British, right? I mean, they're choosing a different imaginary. But that's not the only place I want to emphasize that ideology is located, right? I want to emphasize that it's also located in the planning tools themselves. Right? And so in the very process of having like a 5 or a 10-year national plan, there's a number of assumptions that are built into that exercise or into national income accounting. You're going to start having national income accounting as the basis of your next plan. Right? And the accounts themselves have certain imaginative and ideological factors built into them. And so I think that's what the science technology studies approach has allowed me to do, is to see that, you know, this was a time in which capital investment in big projects was the favorite mode of development. And those weren't necessarily decisions that could be made, those weren't decisions or ideas that were formed necessarily completely in Khartoum or Omdurman or in the capital. These were ideas that were circulating international in the very tools that it seemed that a responsible policymaker would take up, right? And so you felt like you were taking at the cutting edge of research. So you're actually doing what you would say is the public good, right? Which is using the best methods of planning. But within those, you're taking up all these other ideas, you know, the unitary nation, maximizing growth potential, and then what can you count? So you can count certain things better than you can count other things, and you're inheriting all these ideas about what kind of agriculture is efficient, and so
Right.
it's like a stew that's being made.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's like, I mean, the phrase you use is, I think, excellent. This idea of common sense. It's like a new common sense that's formed.
Yeah, I was really also struck by I guess one of those ideologies, like one of the planning ones, like one of the ideologies that's like regulating how people are thinking about planning, particularly the way people are thinking about cotton, just like, you know, so focused on cotton production, almost irrespective sometimes of like fluctuations in the global market. So I was wondering maybe if you could speak to that like, you know, just like relentless focus on cotton.
There's one of the debates that happens in the late 1950s is whether or not Sudan should diversify away from cotton. And so you get Hamza Morgani Hamza arguing with the last British economic advisor, John Carmichael, about whether or not cotton is a suitable crop. And so this is part of where I also had to read against the grain, I guess, is that one of the biggest paper collections I had coming outside of Sudan was John Carmichael's personal paper. But of course, one problem with that is that I have John Carmichael's side of the correspondence, not necessarily always the other side of the correspondence. But from that, I was able to see all these other intellectuals or all these other senior Sudanese officials writing back and forth with him. And one of the alluring things I think about cotton for the Sudanese, and Carmichael says it explicitly, is he says that, you know, Sudan would be fine without necessarily emphasizing growing cotton. It would be stable, but cotton holds out the only possibility of growth for him, in his mind. The idea that Sudan could become a wealthier nation, a more developed nation, it's tied up for him in this idea, and many of the Sudanese elite, in this idea that they can increase their growth of cotton. And in part, I think this has to do with the colonial relationship. One of the problems of the tension between Egypt and Britain had been over Egypt's insistence that it had the right to the majority of the Nile waters. And it was using that to grow cotton. And the British were increasingly upset about this because Egypt had reached sort of the end of its cotton producing capacity. But there was this idea that Sudan was being held back from producing the maximum amount of cotton that it could. And so I think these were also baked in the sort of nationalist moment. But it also the new tool of this idea that growth was possible sort of in the early 1950s also pushed this idea that an investment in cotton held out this sort of uncertain possibility of development.
Yeah. I really appreciate all of this. This was it was pretty much everything I had to ask you about. So yeah, it was really a pleasure to read the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to tell us anything about what you're working on these days, or?
Well, I think some of the things about the South that you mentioned, really stuck out to me. I guess in thinking about, you know, what exactly these like, where the lines are drawn between communities and units, particularly now that the South is independent and it's like orienting itself towards East Africa. I think even a way that you mentioned at some point in the book that Southern policymakers, I guess, were sort of always already thinking about themselves in relationship to Kampala and East African urban centers. So I guess I was really struck by like the length of time that particular like line of thinking has existed, that the South was sort of never really supposed to be a part of some sort of conglomerated thing with the North, but it was always supposed to have been part of East Africa or British East Africa or something. But, you know, just sort of like thinking through where exactly these unit lines are drawn, you know.
I mean, I think one of the things that's surprising and thinking through is that development plans don't really go away. Like the afterlife of development plans is very long. And so, you know, right now one of the big debates is with like the Millennium Dam and in Ethiopia. You see, like, you know, there are plans for this as early as the 1920s, that this was the correct way to, you know, control water. And the decision, right, to include South Sudan with Northern Sudan, right, goes back to dreams from the early 19th century of an Egyptian empire that might go all the way into Uganda. And, you know, and then the discussion sort of in the 1950s, late 1940s, 1950s of South Sudan being part of East Africa or an East African community, these ideas reemerge today. They never, I mean,
right.
I think that's one of the things that's striking is the ways in which development plans or economic imaginaries and political ideas from decades ago have this way of resurfacing.
Yeah. And that also get articulated in these ways around labor markets and thinking about economic futures and yeah.
Right. Is that any more questions, Zachary?
No, I'm good. That was great.
Thank you very much, Zachary, and thank you, Alden, for a very interesting conversation. You know, touched on many angles. Now I'm going to open it up to discussions. If you notice, I've muted all mics because there was some noise coming in the background, and I wasn't sure where that's coming from. So if you've got a question or a comment, please endeavor to unmute your mic and carry on. And when you're done, please mute your mic back. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor for questions now.
Hi.
Hi, Holly.
Jump in. I have a question. And I mean, well, first, thank you, Alden and Zachary, too, like the wonderful Q&A. It was great to hear about Alden's research. I mean, I'm interested in this for those of you who don't know me. I studied Korea, colonial Korea, and the economic production in Korea, some of which involved cotton. The Japanese colonial government tried to get Koreans to produce cotton for Japan. And so I'm interested. In Korea, you get this very interesting scenario where the Japanese government invests in all of this infrastructure to create cotton production. But then once 1945 comes around and Korea is liberated, all of that infrastructure stays in place. And there's some idea that they would continue to produce cotton. But because the network has been like severed almost within the like Japanese bloc economy, it just kind of withers. And, you know, like there's like imports of US cotton that just undercut it. And so it's like this very interesting like mixture between legacies and, you know, like different international trading networks. And so I was really interested hearing at the beginning, you were talking about how does Sudan find new patrons for its economic activity, especially once the British are gone. And so, yeah, given that they do seem to be trying to continue producing cotton and that is like their chosen, like, you know, route to prosperity, does the severing of like the British imperial economic system matter, or does that continue just throughout the international like balance of economic activity at the time?
It matters dramatically. The severing of the British, of their ties with Britain, destroy the cotton economy, or throw the cotton economy in Sudan into uncertainty. Problem for the Sudanese is that they are technically one of the lowest cost producers of high quality cotton in the world. But, and so there's an idea that they can enter the free market of cotton and that they should be able to survive even without guaranteed purchases from the United Kingdom. But of course, one of the reasons that the United Kingdom had invested in cotton in Sudan was in order to avoid spending dollars buying cotton in the United States. And so, it was tied up with this idea of a sterling zone trade area. But one of the problems that the Sudanese have immediately is that both the Americans and the Soviet Union are subsidizing the production of cotton. And there's a technological change that makes high quality cotton or long grain cotton less competitive against short grain cotton. And so the American cotton, which is of lower quality and higher cost to produce, is flooding the market now. And the post-war agreements make so places like Japan and the United Kingdom, they basically are encouraged or have to buy American cotton. And so this is a really large problem for the Sudanese. And I think by 1966, so my story sort of has an ending sort of in the mid-60s. So the first development projects in Sudan are basically done. So Sudan thinks that they can simply grow lots more of it. They're like, we're the low-cost producer. We can grow 4 times as much cotton, and we can race down in the price of cotton on the world market. So what they realized by the mid-1960s is that it's impossible, I argue, for them to pursue development in one country alone. Right? Development actually means that you have to find a new ways to integrate yourself into the world market. And that means you have to participate in rule writing, or even take a subordinate position if that's what's demanded of you.
Oh, thank you, that's fascinating. We need to have a conversation about cotton sometime.
Definitely.
Hi, Alden.
Hi, Tinashe. How are you doing?
Well, I'm great. Well, congratulations. I'm holding the book.
Thank you.
A signed one, so that's great. No, I think it's a really interesting book. And, well, I have a few questions myself. I think it's on page 10 where you question Bates, where Bates said, why should reasonable men adopt policies for the societies they govern? And then you say, unlike Bates, I do not feel that the economic plan has replaced public interest with private interest. And your contention is that decisions about how to allocate resources in 20 years after 1945 were vested in an economizing logic. And yet this narrative about corruption still stands, yet the narrative about neo-patrimonialism is still there. Do you think economic planning is at the heart of the problems that Sudan itself faces, or is something that is more deeply embedded in, I don't know if I should call it ideology, the idea that by the 1960s, even after the cotton prices had collapsed, Sudan is still trying to base its economy on growing and exporting cotton. I don't know if that's it. I could come back after you answer this question. I'm still trying to get my mind around some things.
I think by the end of the research, I would say my understanding of what development means, or the role of development in the 1950s and 1960s, I think has changed. And I think what's at stake is, oh, sorry, could you guys hear me? I think my idea of what development means, or the meaning of development, I think changes in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, I think what it meant in the 1950s and 1960s has changed a bit. And I think part of what's at stake is a discussion of how to organize the international economy itself. And so for the Sudanese, I think they're trying to find a place in the international economy. And so I think cotton had been their stakeholder to be a member of the sterling zone. And I think their preference would have been that they could have independence, but continue sort of in a kind of commonwealth relationship. But they find themselves outside of that as well, because they had never been a colony of Great Britain. They had only been some kind of protector. And so they find themselves in a very disadvantageous position.
Yeah.
But then they find themselves unable to become protected, to come under the patronage of either the United States or the Soviet Union, and with a kind of disadvantageous relationship to Egypt, or a contentious relationship with Egypt. And so they can't find someone to relate to directly. But that's all to say that the first decade of the development project, I think, was an idea that you could grow the Sudanese state sort of alone, and that it could become economically self-sufficient in earning hard currency. And so that, I think, is why cotton is the preferred export. Because cotton to them, more than any of their other crops, could earn hard currency. The alternatives were food. But the main market for food at the time seems to be Egypt. And Egypt would pay them back only in Egyptian pounds. And then they would become trapped in a non-competitive buying manufactured goods from their neighbors. And so that also didn't seem appealing. And so I think these things are, I think it was I think Bates in that way is wrong in that sort of first decade. In the first decade, it was a reasonable assumption on the public interest to continue investing in cotton, even in the face of declining margins on cotton. But I think by 1966, they've been disciplined by the international market. And so this is something where this is perhaps a bit more tentative, but then I think they're taught that that national development alone won't be successful. And so success is about trying to integrate yourself into the international market. And whether or not that's done as a national unit or done, individually through these sort of patronage networks that we often call corruption. But those become necessary. I mean, those become the only ways in which a country like Sudan can integrate itself into the international market.
Okay. I suppose my question is arising out of the idea that what appears to be a decolonized Sudanese state is in fact a colonial state. In the sense that, in terms of colonial treat, they still leave the same structures in place, right? And the development that you are talking about, I've been reading a lot about development, and I know you've read a lot of this material too. Talking stuff about institutions where Hajun Chan is questioning how, whether institutions should lead economic growth. Oh, okay.
Carry on, Tinashe, sorry.
Okay, sorry about that. The work of Gilbert Rist, where he looks at the whole concept of development as, as a global affair, where they question development as, what do they call it? Just a buzzword. And other people who have turned the whole notion of development, who are saying we need to understand what we mean when we're talking about development. So if the Sudanese state becomes this state that captures the country for the purposes of growing cotton, taking the initiative of livelihood from people and determining what they are supposed to grow for the state to get integrated into the international economic system. It sounds to me like what the Sudanese state is actually doing, its government is an agent of international forces, both colonial and how that colony transforms itself in the 1950s and 60s through the Colonial Development Corporation, and of course through the World Bank itself. So whatever is defined as development is actually not determined at home. These economic planners are coming in with knowledge acquired outside about how to run their own so-called economy at home and what development in that context then means. So the question for me is, couldn't we look at Sudan then as some people would want to look at it as a neo-colony, but really as this vast estate for cotton production for international interest, where the state actually has no grip on what's going on, except through its agents who try to accumulate through this neo-patrimonial system.
Mm. No, I mean, I think it's a bit tricky, right? I mean, I think in some ways, while I was writing my project, I kept thinking of like imperial fragments. What do you do if you were given something that was designed as a piece of something larger, right? I mean, so Sudan's economic infrastructure was designed as a piece of a larger machine. You know, the British Empire. Functionality depends on its continued integration into that machine. And then the machine leaves. Or the machine, you know, what do you do if you only have a part of an operating, a part of a tool or a mechanism? And so there's an attempt, you know, one strategy would be to build something new from scratch. Or the other is to try to make use of this again. And many, I think, in the Sudanese planners, they have this idea that they're going to be able to make use of the infrastructure that they have.
Yes.
In a different relationship than the one that they had previously with their two colonial powers, Egypt and Britain. So they think that they can bargain, right? I mean, part of the colonial moment or the post-colonial moment is this idea that you can bargain on your terms of access. So they do bargain, right? They get increased political independence, but the consequence is that Britain immediately, right before, 2 years before independence, says, okay, you're having increased political independence, so we no longer have to buy your cotton. So we're also changing the terms on their side. And so it's a bit of a negotiation, I think. What will be the terms of political independence and economic integration? And what the Sudanese, I think, find to their great displeasure is that it's true. Having the productive capacity in your home country is a certain amount of power, but having access to the markets is another amount of power. And they find that their ability to control production and even to increase production is not nearly as much power as control as the access to markets on the other side. So they find themselves in a bit of a disadvantaged situation. But, and so I think that becomes one of the initial dilemmas, right? Is that political independence, especially without a voice and norm and rule writing on global markets, is not as much power as one might have initially assumed in the early 1950s. And this becomes, I think, one of the major dilemmas that all of these states have to deal with. And I think it's something I'm wrestling with now. I mean, Sudan by the mid-1970s and 1980s is going to basically export its people as the most valuable commodity that they have, right? Becomes technical expertise and technical professionals, right? They start exporting their own professionals to other markets to work because they don't.
This is the last question.
Strategy.
Yeah, following up on that, because what you've just described for me is exactly what I think the problem is. Because your book looks at these economic planners, right? And you've just given a background of how Sudan was part of this sterling machinery, sterling area machinery. And it was very important, especially in the post-Second World War period, because it provides a source of cotton within the empire. And that substitutes, you know, American South markets and other extra sterling markets. So it's crucial in that regard. But at the same time, it is also an expensive asset for the British to maintain. So what do? They need to get rid of it. How do they do this? They turn empire into Commonwealth, generally speaking, right? Now, for me, the role of these economic planners, and this is what I think, although not explicitly said, is demonstrated in the book, is that they are bringing in methods of statecraft that are designed elsewhere. Measurement, using GDP, and all of these things. And for me, that is the fundamental aspect of that relationship. Sudan remains this huge cotton plantation, initially for the empire, but as the empire relinquishes its global role for the Northern Hemisphere, if I could put it that way. And this is what I kind of picked from the book. And in the end, what we have is a situation whereby the colony, it's becoming an imperialism of free trade, if you will. Yes, I don't know if that makes any sense. So I think that speaks in a very strong way to other African economies that are caught in this trap, which have the idea that what development is getting loans from it's now called the Commonwealth Development Corporation, no longer the Colonial Development Corporation, which is ironic in a very specific way, and the World Bank. But what is it that they are producing? They're using these loans for developing this infrastructure to produce for the Northern Hemisphere under terms that they still don't determine. If they don't produce enough, how are they punished? They are punished through the currency connection. Their currency depreciates. And economic problems emerge and states go under threat of being removed. And this is where we then see these governments using neo-patrimonial tools to retain power in spite of their incapacity to sustain an economy. So once they remain in power, they still try to find ways in which they try to improve the economy so they can stay in power. But improving economies means digging ever deeper into that trap of producing cotton for those markets. So in my conclusion, I would say it seems to me that the empire is stronger now than it was during the days of colonial rule itself.
Thank you, Tinashe.
Oh, I guess.
Thanks. Any other questions, please?
Hey guys, can you hear me? I had like a lot of problems with the audio.
Hi, Maria.
Okay, Maria, go through.
How are you doing?
Guys.
Good.
I really enjoyed your talk. I just wanted to follow up on the stuff that Tinashe was saying, because I think for me in what I'm trying to write about South Africa and kind of the connections to London today is precisely this question of like, how do you deal with imperial formations that are technically like belonging in the 1870s, 1880s, but that have some kind of repercussions that reproduce themselves even today in like very different forms, because obviously, I mean, the ANC is governing a state that's relatively strong and that has a lot of policy space in theory, but yet you have a mining sector that is very much looking like it did with some transformation within the ownership structures, but still like the connections to London where the profits go off to, and this relationship between kind of national policy making that's trying to integrate itself into the global economy on better terms somehow is still hampered by like just what Tinashe was saying about currency depreciation. Like every time now that there's been like debates on nationalisation or like more radical economic policies, the South African rand has just plummeted. Like whatever you do politically is just punished by, you know, Standard & Poor's and Moody's and whatever. And now when they elected Ramaphosa, who's more of a liberal economically speaking, then the currency appreciates again. when you like seriously, like, this is not some economic fundamental that you're talking about, right? You're punishing certain economic policy directions. So I was just wondering whether like you have any thoughts on how to think of, like, for me the problem is I'm not sure how to talk about the structures of that relationship without becoming like overly deterministic in the way that you talk about it.
I mean, on one hand, I think what Wolfgang Streeck, he has this phrase, capital strike. I think capital strikes are real, right?
Yeah.
And I think that we should, I don't think we should get so caught up with the systemic analysis of global finance or the world economy as not to think that there are personalized entities that can make sort of these kinds of decisions, right? I mean, so punishment is real, right? But I mean, there's this Robert Bates and Coates Swift article where he compares African independence with Latin American independence, and one of their arguments is the time frame we're talking about is still relatively short. I mean, in South Africa, it's very short, right? I mean, since the 90s, the ANC has been in power, and so what one can expect to have been done to transform longer legacies is, I think it's not as easy as we often think that it should be. I mean, Sudan, not in my period, but in the later alternative, there will be several alternatives. So right after my period, there's another military coup in which the Communist Party comes to power. And they try over a year or two to reorganize the economy. The communists are then slaughtered, and there's a series of invasions. And then again, in 1989, the Islamist parties come to power. And Hassan al-Turabi very explicitly says that he wants to change the global order, the regional order, because Sudan cannot develop without a revolution in the regional order. And so he tries someone in Sudan participates in an attempt to assassinate Hosni Mubarak of Egypt. There's an idea that you can break the relationship with Egypt altogether because Egypt leads to the underdevelopment of Sudan. You can realign to the Arabs once the Americans are kicked out. But I mean, these are dramatic. I mean, the diagnosis, I think, which is correct in a way, is that it would take a regional level transformation and then transformation, international economic transformation, in order to allow more policy flow. But the consequences of that are that Sudan is economically isolated for 20 years under a sanctions regime that sort of breaks the country. And today, Sudan is America's largest security cooperator in Northeast Africa. And so I mean, the dilemmas, I think, are actually very real. And I think it can be a bit foolhardy for us to assume that policymakers acting responsibly can simply take a dramatically harsher line. I mean, there's this phrase I like that I think John Lonsdale said, that they're improvising in tight corners. Like, policymaking is improvisation in these very tight corners. And it's a long process. I mean, I think you're trying to build up increased policy space, but you're doing it quite slowly. And so Sudan has completely reoriented its economy, right? Cotton is no longer an important part of the Sudanese economy. It now primarily grows foodstuffs and dairy. It's much more connected to the Gulf states. It's broken its relationships with Egypt. It's trying to become connected to Ethiopia. So these are long-term structural shifts, but at quite high cost. Right? I mean, and so even if you were to look at it at any given moment, you might say it's a failure, but Sudanese policymakers have consistently pursued a policy of increased autonomy, but it's been very difficult. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.